Good morning, sixth grade. So we're going to go ahead and start chapter 24, lesson 3 today. This will be our last ed puzzle for this week. So we have lesson 3, World War I begins. Let's go ahead and get started on the reading.
Lesson 3, World War I begins. It matters because the events of World War I were a social, economic, technological, and political turning point for many nations in the modern era. Causes of conflict. Guiding question. What factors threatened the peace in Europe after 1900? Following Napoleon's defeat, Europeans enjoyed a long period of peace. In the early 1900s, however, tensions increased among the European powers. What factors caused these tensions? Nationalism. Many of the tensions in Europe were the result of nationalism. Nationalism is a strong feeling of loyalty to one's country. Nationalism had earlier united Italy and Germany into strong nations. There was also a surge of nationalism in France and Britain. Meanwhile, the spread of nationalism threatened to tear apart other European territories, such as Austria-Hungary. Empire building. Tensions in Europe also came from the desire to build empires. Britain, also known as the United Kingdom, had issues to face. During the 1800s, several European nations had competed to set up colonies in Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world. Britain and France held the largest overseas empires and wanted to further enlarge them. Germany and Italy also wanted to add to their territories. By 1900, after decades of imperialism, much of the world's land area was already under the control of European powers. Consequently, European nations often came into conflict with each other as they tried to expand. Military increases. As European nations built their empires, they strengthened their military forces. If one nation increased the size of its military, its rivals increased their own forces. As a result, a spirit of militarism spread throughout Europe. This term refers to a high regard for military might. Leaders in Germany, France, and Russia formed enormous armies. They used conscription to increase the size of their forces. Conscription means that a government requires citizens to serve in the military for a certain period of time. Conscription is also called a draft. Britain had the world's largest and most powerful navy. In the early 1900s, Germany set out to expand its naval forces. The British viewed this as a threat and began building even more warships. A rivalry soon grew between Britain and Germany. Creating military alliances. As spending for arms rose, European powers made alliances, or agreements to help one another in the event of war. By 1914, two major alliances had been created. The Triple Alliance was made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Then Britain, France, and Russia joined in the Triple Entente. An entente is an understanding among nations. The purpose of the alliances was to keep peace by creating a balance of power. A balance of power prevents any one country from dominating the others. Yet Europe's alliances actually created a great danger. An attack on one nation could easily start a war involving many countries. Trouble in the Balkans. In the early 1900s, the Balkan Peninsula in southeastern Europe was aflame with nationalist rivalries. The Balkans had long been under the rule of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. As nationalism spread, ethnic groups within both empires demanded self-rule. The South Slavs were one of these groups. They included the Serbs, Bosnians, Croats, and Slovenes. The first to win freedom were the Serbs. They formed a state called Serbia and united the South Slavs. The leaders of Austria-Hungary feared that the idea of a South Slav kingdom would harm their empire. As a result, they tried to limit Serbia's expansion. In 1908, Austria-Hungary took over Serbia's neighbor, Bosnia. The Serbs were furious. With Russian support, the Serbs prepared for war. Then Emperor William II of Germany demanded that Russia accept Austria-Hungary's takeover of Bosnia or face war with Germany. Russia backed down. However, it was determined not to be humiliated by Germany again. In 1912, the Balkan League, Bulgaria, Greece, Montenegro, and Serbia, declared war on the Ottoman Empire. As a result, the Turks lost nearly all their European territory. The Balkan League, however, soon fell apart. Greeks and Serbs demanded land that Bulgaria had won in the war, so Bulgaria attacked the Greeks and Serbs. The Turks saw their chance to win back land and attacked Bulgaria. The Treaty of Bucharest resulted in an uneasy peace. Progress check. Explaining. Why did European countries form alliances? War breaks out in Europe. Guiding question. Why did war break out in Europe in 1914? In June 1914, in Sarajevo, a small town in Bosnia, crowds gathered to see Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. While driving through the streets of Sarajevo, the Archduke and his wife were shot and killed. A young Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip had pulled the trigger. He belonged to a Serb nationalist group called the Black Hand. This group wanted the Bosnian Serbs, ruled by Austria-Hungary, to be part of a South Slav state headed by Serbia. Austria-Hungary blamed the Serb government for the murder. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The conflict spreads. Europe's alliance system caused the war to spread quickly. Russia, Serbia's ally, began mobilization, or the gathering and movement of troops. Germany aided its ally Austria-Hungary and declared war on Russia on August 1st. It then declared war on France, Russia's ally. In order to attack France, Germany's soldiers had to advance through Belgium. On August 4th, German forces invaded Belgium, breaking a treaty that had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality. Britain, honoring a promise to protect Belgium, declared war on Germany. The Great War, as World War I was later called, had begun. On one side were the Allies, France, Russia, Britain, and Italy. On the other side, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. What was the Western Front? The Western Front was the battle zone between France and Germany, where much of the fighting took place. In September 1914, the French and British stopped the German advance on the Western Front. However, it soon became clear that neither side was going to win the war quickly or easily. The fighting reached a standoff. For the next 3 years, the opposing armies became involved in trench warfare. On each side, troops dug themselves into the ground in trenches protected by barbed wire. Trenches along the front lines provided protection, and those behind the lines served as medical stations, headquarters, and storage areas. To break the standoff, soldiers climbed out of the trenches and crossed over open ground while enemy soldiers fired machine guns at them. Neither side made significant military advances, and thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded. War and technology. World War I was different from earlier conflicts. New technology introduced more powerful weapons. Machine guns fired bullets rapidly. Improved cannons and other artillery fired larger shells at greater distances. Newly developed submarines attacked ships at sea. Early versions of airplanes battled each other with machine guns. They also bombed enemy towns. Tanks, flamethrowers, and poison gases were also introduced. What is a total war? As the war dragged on, it became a total war. This means that entire societies, not just armies, became involved in fighting. World War I affected the lives of all citizens. Governments on both sides trained and supplied large armies. They raised taxes and borrowed vast sums of money. They rationed or placed limits on civilians' use of food and materials needed for the war. Governments also set wages and prices, banned strikes, and took over industries and railroads. Government officials also tried to shape public opinion. They used propaganda, biased government-controlled information, to control citizens thinking about war. Total war required many new civilian workers to help in producing war goods. As millions of young men went to the battlefields, women took their places in factories. Women's contributions during the war aided women's rights. By war's end, many countries were ready to give the vote to women. Progress check. Defining. What is a total war? A global war. Guiding question. How did World War I affect the world outside of Europe? World War I reached beyond Western Europe to other parts of the world. European nations received badly needed resources from their empires. They also drafted soldiers from their overseas colonies to serve on the Western Front. Eastern Front. While the war on the Western Front dragged on, Russia battled Germany and Austria-Hungary on the Eastern Front, the battle zone in Eastern Europe. Unlike armies in the West, armies in the East covered a lot of territory. However, neither side was able to win a complete victory. Germany and Austria-Hungary were determined to remove Russia from the war. Russia was the least industrialized of the European powers and did not have the resources to fight a modern war. Even though the Russians suffered severe losses, they managed to stay in the war. Russia's efforts helped the Allies on the Western Front to drive back the Russians. Germany had to move some of its Western Front divisions to the Eastern Front. This move brought success in the East, but it weakened Germany's position along the Western Front. America supports the Allies. The war in Europe also affected the United States. When World War I began, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson declared that the United States would be neutral in the conflict. Many Americans, however, did take sides. Many of the president's advisors supported the Allies. They argued that if the Allies won, it would strengthen democracy and maintain a balance of power in the world. In addition, the United States had more financial and economic ties to the Allies than they did to the Central Powers. Controlling the seas, the British Navy placed a blockade on Germany. That is, British naval ships prevented goods from leaving or entering German ports. To wear down British sea power, the Germans began using submarines called U-boats. In February 1915, the Germans warned that they would sink any ship entering British waters. The British passenger liner Lusitania ignored the warning and sailed into the war zone. A German submarine torpedoed the ship, killing more than 1,100 passengers, including 128 Americans. President Wilson threatened to end diplomatic ties if Germany did not stop its sea attacks. In response, the Germans stopped unlimited submarine warfare for a while. America enters the war. In January 1917, German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann sent a telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico. Zimmermann suggested that Mexico should ally itself with Germany. In return, Mexico could reclaim lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. American newspapers printed the telegram, and outraged Americans began demanding war with Germany. They realized Germany was trying to control their nearest neighbor. Also in January, Germany announced that it would sink on sight all merchant vessels sailing to Allied ports. An angry President Wilson broke off relations with Germany. After Germany sank 4 American merchant ships, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. On April 6, 1917, the United States entered World War I. Progress check. Explaining. Why did the U.S. favor the Allies in World War I?